This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered.
Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 182 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. This is the final episode in the National Literacy Month series that I'm doing as part of the B Podcast Network in partnership with Reading is Fundamental. To catch you up, in the month of September, I published some extra episodes as part of this campaign to support literacy. Reading is Fundamental is a nonprofit that focuses on connecting educators and families with materials and training aligned with evidence-based literacy instruction. Not only is their model aligned with the science of reading, they also offer unique book ownership for solutions and families to address book equity issues. You can learn more about Reading is Fundamental, as well as the B Podcast Network, in the show notes. In this episode, I'm talking about leveraging read-alouds to build language and getting started with advocacy work with Dr. Molly Ness. Many skeptics of the science of reading are concerned that structured approaches will bore kids and make it less likely that they'll enjoy reading. These concerns are unfounded for a number of reasons. First, structured approaches help reach kids who won't learn well through implicit learning, which is a lot of kids. It's hard to develop a love of something when you failed repeatedly and no one has given you the tools to do it. Enjoyment comes with competence and confidence. Second, many people assume that the science of reading is all about drilling phonics worksheets, but it's not at all. Good teachers know how to make structured approaches engaging and interesting, even if they're challenging. Good phonics instruction is not about drill and kill. And finally, the science of reading is about way more than just phonics. It includes research on many other linguistic skills that help students decode, comprehend sentences, understand what they're reading, spelling words, or communicating through writing. Read-alouds and think-alouds are a powerful, accessible way to build these important language skills. That's why I invited Dr. Molly Ness to episode 182 as part of the National Literacy Month series to talk about literacy advocacy work and the power of think-alouds and read-alouds. Dr. Molly Ness is a former classroom teacher, a reading researcher, and a teacher educator. She earned a doctorate in reading education at the University of Virginia and spent 16 years as an associate professor at Fordham University in New York City. She is the author of 5 books. She served on the board of directors for the International Literacy Association and is a New York State chapter founder of the Reading League. Dr. Ness has extensive experience in reading clinics, consulting with school districts, leading professional development, and advising school systems on research-based reading instruction. She provided literacy leadership for nationally recognized literacy nonprofits, as well as major educational publishers. In 2024, Molly was invited to serve on the New York State Dyslexia Task Force. A frequent speaker and presenter, her happy place is translating the science of reading to schools and teachers. As a tireless literacy advocate, Molly created the End Book Deserts podcast, which brings awareness to the 32 million American children who lack access to books. She's currently writing a forthcoming scholastic book helping teachers understand orthographic mapping. In 2024, she founded Dirigo Literacy, a literacy consulting firm supporting schools, districts, and states, helping them align and implement the science of reading. In this conversation, we discuss the impact of vocabulary on comprehension, the science of reading as an evolving body of work instead of a trend or a curriculum, book deserts, both concerning statistics and how to help, getting started with policy briefs and advocacy work. And then we wrap up by talking about think-alouds and read-alouds and why they're not just for younger kids and why they're non-negotiable. Before I get going, I wanted to mention that there's still time to get 25% off when you join either Language Therapy Advanced Foundations or the School of Clinical Leadership. This special offer is going from September 15th through October 15th. Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is my program that helps SLPs build a framework for language therapy that supports vocabulary and comprehension. And the School of Clinical Leadership is my program that helps related service providers put programming in place, as well as design services that support executive functioning in collaboration with their school teams. To learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. And to learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. To get the special rate of 25% off, you can enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page. Now, please enjoy this interview with Dr. Molly Ness. Today, I am joined by Dr. Molly Ness, a researcher, an educator, and many other things. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I think let's start off by having you share a little bit about yourself, your background, and the work that you're doing now.
Sure. I started my career as a classroom teacher in Oakland, California, teaching middle school, and was ready to dive into social studies curriculum and content, and quickly realized my kids could not read, and that I was not well prepared to help them read. So after teaching for a while, came back east and got a PhD in reading education at the University of Virginia, and recognized that specifically within the subset of comprehension, my real interest was translating research to those who need it most, classroom teachers, school leaders, and then spent almost 20 years as a professor at Fordham University, the Graduate School of Education, smack in the middle of New York City. And while I was there, I wrote a bunch of peer-reviewed articles. I wrote some practitioner teacher books around comprehension, around the science of reading and language building, and have just always felt that literacy is a social justice issue that matters most to me. And we are talking at a time that is particularly exciting in our nation's literacy landscape, with so much conversation and media coverage about reading. So it's been an exciting couple of years to watch what I have always cared so passionately about really get the attention that it much deserves, which is we can do better with regard to reading instruction.
Yeah. I totally agree about the social justice aspect. I think that a lot of times when you think of school, it's not just about grades. And yes, obviously grades are a representation of what you've learned, or at least people think they should be, but it's so much more than that. It's about the skills and what they do for you beyond school and the opportunities that you have if you are literate, if you're able to read and write, and what that does for you as far as just being able to advocate for yourself, have access to job opportunities, to just be out in the community. So yeah, so many different things. I'm curious what kinds of things you've published about. I know we're going to get into some of those things today, but just can you give us kind of an overview before we dive into talking about some of the things that you talk about from a more practical standpoint for teachers?
Sure. So my areas of research interest have always been in comprehension. So I started as a doctoral student studying reading comprehension instruction, and then wrote a book all about metacognition, your sort of awareness of your own thinking, and using think-alouds, which are when we literally like crack open our head and verbalize the invisible process that we as proficient readers use to make meaning of text. So I wrote a book around that. And my most recent book is about the instructional power of read-alouds. There have been so many conversations in the media and in documentary movies and podcasts and such about phonics and decoding, what I call sort of the word identification, lifting the word off the page. But we know that reading is much more than just lifting words off the page. You have to be able to understand what you're reading. And when we talk about read-alouds and language comprehension, they are a key piece of the reading puzzle. And so I've been doing a lot of work around effective read-alouds, how they need to happen for kids of all ages, not just our early childhood kids, across all domains of knowledge, across all different content areas, and that they're really non-negotiables. They are not sort of one of those luxuries, or if my kids earn it with good behavior, or if I have time, I'll get to a read aloud. They really are the cornerstone of effective classroom instruction.
Yeah, and there's so many things I could talk about there. I wanted to get into some of your advocacy work first, and then talk about the tactical things, but I like how you say read alouds and think alouds, because now we're getting into the executive functioning piece, and I would put metacognition under that umbrella as well. So, yeah, I mean, just the idea that kids need to be explicitly taught how to do that in many cases. Yes, some kids might be doing it on their own, but for the ones who don't, they do need that modeling of how would you be thinking in your head about what you're reading and what's your dialogue like. So, yeah, I bet
Yeah,
there's we
that
can.
word that word modeling is exactly what a think aloud is. And we all do think alouds
Mhm,
without knowing consciously the term for them. I always equate them with, if you've ever taught a kindergartner how to tie their shoelaces, and you say, first, I'm going to make bunny ears, and next, I'm going to push one loop through another. That's a
mhm.
think aloud. It's just with a specific skill. But when we do think alouds around comprehension, we're showing kids how to make meaning. And typically, what we do when we read aloud is we ask a lot of questions, and those questions assess kids' comprehension, but they don't build kids' comprehension. And a think aloud builds comprehension.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction, because sometimes what I found, and this is under the area of metacognition, which, as we were talking before we hit record, both of us have done a lot of work in this area as it pertains to vocabulary. What I have found that sometimes people do is, when they're working on vocabulary and you have a student who you read the paragraph and it's like, okay, tell me about what you read, or here's this object, describe it and tell me everything that you know about this. And we should be doing some inner dialogue. We should be having a think aloud and doing that as we're talking about that word. But when you're just giving kids questions over and over again, and you're not modeling, this is how you can be asking yourself questions in your head. Excuse me. What that does is it almost makes kids prompt dependent if you don't have that think aloud element. And so that's a distinction that I like to make for people, is that you have to, it's not just about asking them questions to assess, it's showing them that they can be asking themselves the questions to figure out what steps to take, to figure out if they're making meaning, and just to assess their own comprehension and help themselves better comprehend.
Sure. And then everything you're saying is confirmed by the research. When teachers and parents, this is not something that has to happen in school classrooms. It's something that can happen at bedtime stories and whatever skills you're teaching your child at home. That think alouds are really impactful. We have a whole body of research that shows them making an impact on kids, ages 3 all the way up to college age students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like how you put it as body of research, because I think that when we're talking about the science of reading, it's this, oh, it's a pendulum swing. And people who think it's a pendulum swing, I think that they don't understand what all it entails, that it is a body of work. It's not just data and one study. It's not a curriculum. It's years and years that has stacked and layered study upon study and different types of methodologies. And I think that part of it is, oh, it's just phonics, it's drilling, it's boring. Well, that's not what the science of reading is. It's all these other elements woven together.
Yeah, I'm doing a ton of work in schools and in districts to better understand the science of reading as a longstanding body of reading research. And I also just want to point out it's an evolving body of research.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading a book by Adam Grant now called
Mm-hmm.
Think Again, which basically is all about how science is the point of science is to help us evaluate and change our opinions. And it's not, we often sort of criticize politicians for being flip-flopping in terms of changing their mind on one policy, but that's what good scientists do. They take
Yeah.
new incoming information and evaluate what their thinking is. And so I've been doing a lot of thinking recently about comprehension instruction and the role of strategies. But you're right that the body of research known as the science of reading is not a pendulum swing. It's not just hyper focused on phonics or decoding, but it's really an interdisciplinary, long-standing body of research. When I was a graduate student, which was, I don't want to say that it was almost 30 years ago because that means I'm old, but it was a ways back.
Yeah.
I was reading the science of reading. At that time, we were calling it scientifically based reading research.
Mm-hmm.
Same idea, just a different name, that this is the peer-reviewed cream of the crop, high quality research, which helps us understand the cognitive processes that we undergo to become readers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the example of policy and flip-flopping. It's that is challenging. And I mean, I'm in a position now where I feel like day to day I say, well, I think we need to make this decision here. And then you learn about, you get more information and then you change your mind. And that it is hard. I understand that sometimes, especially when things get political, you're supposed to take a firm stance and be decisive, and I think you can, with the assumption that you say, here is the best decision that I can make now based on what I know. And we're going to continue to evaluate it and continue to say, is this the best thing? And I think from a policy standpoint, which is really hard because policy takes a long time to get passed and all of that. But yeah, it is important to do that. So I know that you've done some work with policy and you wrote a policy brief about book deserts. So I would love to hear about that, because I know that people who are in that practitioner role, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a therapist, or even people who are in the more middle management, principals, directors, not working directly with students, but very much tied to the schools, it can feel very overwhelming to think about, here are all these things that are impacting my students, my community, and I feel like I don't have control over everything, or the things that I would like to be able to control, because you send kids off after they leave the campus and you don't know what's going to happen. Like, they're going to all different kinds of environments once they leave school. And a lot of that is, it seems like it's out of our control. So anyways, I'd love to hear about what you've done in the area of policy.
Sure. So my policy work comes from my advocacy work around book access. So when I was a university professor, I came across some research that helped me understand how much book access is a challenge, particularly for our kids living in low-income communities. The statistics show that 32 million American children lack access to books in their homes, schools, and communities. And this is recent research. This is not stuff that's, 50 years old.
Mm-hmm.
60% of our low-income families can't afford books at home. And I was just completely floored by that research. Imagine being a kid who, outside of school hours, didn't have books. How can we build lifelong literacy habits if kids don't have books? And so what I did was I recognized that as somebody who has been living in the reading research world for almost 3 decades, if I didn't know about this as an ongoing issue, that lots of people probably didn't know. And so I started a podcast. It's called End Book Deserts, and desert has one S. If it has two S's, it's dessert. To raise awareness that book access is an ongoing challenge. So in the podcast, I highlight about 50 different programs all across the country who work to get books to kids in really innovative ways. Everything from a sort of small grassroots organization to a big Dolly Parton imagination library. And the point of the podcast, again, is awareness, but also for those people who are working in book donation programs and literacy culture and all these sorts of organizations, is to come together and sort of say, if something worked in Philadelphia, maybe it'll work in Phoenix. If there's a program that's doing really well in Baltimore, let's make that happen in Birmingham. What I was finding in all of these different interviews is that people were sort of operating in silos. There wasn't a professional community or organization for people who were interested in book access, libraries and community programs and literacy centers. And so through that podcast, which began about 5 years ago, we've had a couple of different conferences. There's now a group called the National Book Access Association, really working to spotlight this as an issue and to curate resources, to share ideas, and to groupthink and get some attention around policy so that book access becomes an issue of the past.
Yeah. I mean, I think it can feel overwhelming to think, what can I do about this? I mean, there's so many things where, again, like I said, you feel like it's outside of your control, but I think book access, especially for people who are in the world of reading and education as a whole, it is one thing. It's a tangible step that you can take. I think that people don't get started with policy work because it feels overwhelming and you think, what difference can I make? And this is something tangible and as you point out, it's realistic. It's possible that we can make a dent in the the book access issue. So you cited some statistics, but what else do you share in that policy brief? And I guess a better question to start with is, what is a policy brief and how did you do it? What were the steps for doing that?
So a policy brief is meant to be a relatively short thing where we state the issue, state the problem, back it up with some research and statistics, and then make some concrete recommendations for next steps. And so in this policy brief, I point out, obviously, some of these statistics, excuse me, as well as some concrete ideas to address the problem. Everything from what can one individual person do, and that might be donating time. There are all sorts of book banks all over the country that need help sorting books. I have had kids on my podcast who, for their bar mitzvah or for their community service in high school, they led book drives in their Boy Scout group or their church or their community. There are all sorts of ways that people can donate money and resources, and then all the way to more sort of holistic state level, wider policy implications. At one point in our country, there was a piece of national legislation introduced. I believe it was by Edward Kennedy, who sort of proposed similar to our program around food stamps, where families living under the poverty line get a certain amount of money allocated that they can use to buy the essentials. That this piece of legislation, which did not eventually pass, but it proposed the same idea for learning materials. If you were a family living below the poverty line, you would be able to use this amount of money to go buy books and educational games and puzzles and sorts of things. So all the way from sort of a policy suggestion from what one particular community can do to more holistic, wider level policy. And there's so many different entry points. And that's what's been fun about the podcast, is featuring these innovative people and programs who have just done really brilliant things. There are programs that take vending machines and suit them out so that they work with publishers and they get brand new copies of the books that kids want to read, and they put these vending machines in highly trafficked, visible areas like playgrounds and the Boys and Girls Clubs. And kids can go and get books. There are programs that train pediatricians and family healthcare providers to give books when families and children come to well child visits. These pediatricians and family care providers talk with parents about the importance of literacy and give not only books, but real concrete tips about how to raise young readers, young children to become readers. So there's all sorts of different entry points and ways that people can get involved wherever they are and whatever their resources are, be it time or money or just advocacy.
Yeah. I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about the School of Clinical Leadership and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. As you're listening to the conversation, you're probably starting to realize how important it is for professionals to work on building their own skill sets for how they work directly with students, as well as understanding how systems work and putting strategic plans in place for working with the whole team. Because you can make a big impact with direct intervention, but you can make an even bigger impact if you take it a step further and also think about leadership and advocacy. So I help you do both things in the School of Clinical Leadership and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. In Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, I help SLPs and other professionals working on language create a system for language therapy so they can walk into sessions confident that they're giving kids the skills that they need to succeed and that they're building those foundational language skills that support high-level comprehension and literacy. To learn more about that program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. Now, many of my Language Therapy Advanced Foundation students, once they start to get confident in their protocol, realize that they need to be collaborating with their teams. So that's really the next step. And many of them realize that they should be working on executive functioning as well. Now, there's plenty of executive functioning work embedded into Language Therapy Advanced Foundations because work on metacognition is so important to effective language intervention. But we also have to think about what the entire team is doing because students need support when they leave your room. And part of that is ensuring the right scaffolding is in place across the environments that students are in. And when we think about executive functioning, we have to think about more than just literacy and academics. We also have to think about how students self-regulate, how they interact socially, and how they handle those unstructured situations during their school day, as well as outside of their school day. And you need a framework for navigating all of that, because now, once we move beyond thinking about direct intervention, we're thinking about multiple service delivery models. And you need a framework for making that happen. I help you do that in the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. You can learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. As part of the Reading is Fundamental series, you can get 25% off either program, or actually both programs if you wanted to join both, between September 15th and October 15th. Just enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page when you're signing up to get this special rate. So what do you have to do? I mean, is it something that you can just put together and make available, or is there some kind of a formal process to put together a brief?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. So, I love writing. I have always loved writing, and see one of my skills as using writing for advocacy. And so
Mm-hmm.
I sort of just looked at policy briefs that have informed my work, and I was, pretty knowledgeable about the statistics around book access. So wrote the brief with real concrete recommendations. I mean, that's really what the point of a brief
Mm-hmm.
is
Yeah.
first of all, to contextualize the problem, but then give actionable items. For me, the challenge has always been getting the brief out to as many people as possible to listen to it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm just one person. I don't necessarily have the access to get it out to politicians and such. So what we know about briefs is that they are powerful when they are shared. So the brief you can access on my website, which is endbookdeserts.com.
Mm-hmm.
And it's meant to be shared widely. So I encourage people to read it and use it as a way to write their own briefs about whatever their advocacy issues are. I looked at book access as my particular lens, but obviously
Mm-hmm.
there's so many different ways that we can all use our writing and our voices as advocacy.
I love that you point that out, because just that someone could use your brief and create their own brief. Just, it sounds so official. It sounds like, oh, I wouldn't be able to do that, but you literally could just, I mean, I'm sure it was a lot of work for you, which you probably had already done a lot of the work up front by the time you got to the point of writing it, but that it's something that if you're knowledgeable about something, you can do the research, you can put it out there, and then the work is just making it known. And then I think I'm sure that potential next steps as far as lobbying efforts and other action items and just education, as you're doing with the podcast, would be logical next steps. And then it's just a matter of, I think, networking and all of that, which is definitely not easy, but I think the point is sometimes to put it out there and
Yeah.
to take the first step.
And it is getting to the audiences that
Mm-hmm.
I intended it to. This a few months ago, I was contacted by New Jersey senatorial candidate Andy Kim, and one of his platforms is really a lot of early childhood support, and so he was interested in reading it to better understand, is this something I could have a sort of a platform or a candidacy around. So we're starting to see senators and elected officials getting a hold of it. So hopefully that's one of many people who get a hold of it.
That's awesome. That would be so cool to be. I mean, if like a politician reached out to me, it would be like, whoa, hey. So I wanted to shift and make sure we talked about think-alouds and read-alouds. And, I, as you said before, it's a non-negotiable, really. And I think what else is so powerful about it is the accessibility piece, and how it just takes a lot of areas and is kind of the glue in a way. I mean, there's obviously all of the disciplines, there's the content areas. As you said, you were a social studies teacher. There are, again, a lot of specific contexts where kids might have the opportunity to build vocabulary. They're in their speech therapy session, they're in their classroom, they're home with their parents. And then there's all this conversation of, okay, we want to make sure that kids have access to books, but also, do families know what to do? Do families know what to do at home? And some of the more technical things, when we're talking about explicit instruction and reading, it is very hard. I know, because I'm in the position where I'm sharing information with families as well. And I don't want it to be confusing and inaccessible to them, because it's like so many steps and overwhelming. But read-alouds are something that is very feasible for other people to do. And and again, like at home, at school, in lots of different places. Obviously, it might look a little different in each setting, but I'd love for you to talk about just take us step by step how you would do the strategy and, what that could look like.
Sure. So I'm so glad you brought this up because there as parents, we often get this, you should be reading with your child. I kind of feel like that advice is such a blanket statement. It's sort of like when I go to the doctor and the doctor's like, you need to eat a healthy diet. I'm like,
Yeah.
such a blanket statement. Show me what my plate should look like. How many grams of protein do I want? So I really like drilling down to the specificities. The number one thing that I say to parents and caregivers is reading aloud to your child should be a joyful activity. It should not be drudgery. It should not be something that you're like, now is our read aloud time. It should be around an entertaining bonding moment. And the benefits of read alouds continue for children all the way up to age 18. We need to push past this, our kids outgrow read alouds. There's actually a pretty compelling study that shows that most parents, there's something called the decline at 9. When kids hit age 9, read alouds drop significantly because parents think kids are, it's too babyish or the kids can read on their own. But when you dig into that, kids actually say, I wish my parent or caregiver kept reading. So I say, continued reading to your kid in middle school and high school. That's when you can get into juicy books with big, juicy topics to debate. I also want parents and caregivers to know you do not have to read in English. If you are not a native English speaker, or if you are not somebody who sees reading as a particular area of strength for you, you can still do read alouds in your native language, in simple concept books. So I always get sometimes when I work with parents, people will come up to me afterwards and sort of embarrassedly say, is it okay if I read to my child in Spanish? And I say, yes, absolutely. They still get the same language comprehension, literacy benefits. And so we have to be mindful that there's no right way to do a read aloud. The other thing that I also tell parents is, in many ways, we sort of envision this read aloud as a bedtime story, sort of winding down your day, the snuggly moment when kids are in bed. And that may not work for your realities. When I was a professor, I taught until 9 o'clock at night because we had teachers in the field and they had to take classes in the evening. And I'll be honest, when my daughter was 3 and 4 years old and I was coming home at 9:30 at night, did I have the energy to make my voice animated and make that read aloud engaging? No. So I had to find a time that worked for me. And so maybe it was first thing in the morning, or maybe it was bath time when you kind of have a captive audience. Your kids in the tub, like they can't really go anywhere. Great time to do a read aloud. So I think we have to push past this. There's one way to do a read aloud. But there are important things that I think we can include in our read alouds. I think the first thing we have to do is know that whatever text we're reading has background knowledge in it that the text assumes that the reader has. And we have to be mindful that not every kid has that knowledge. So sometimes there may be things we have to do before the read aloud where we say to kids, this book is about this. Here's what you need to know. I'm thinking of the Mo Willems book, Knuffle Bunny, which so many parents and children love. Mo Willems. Well, Knuffle Bunny is set at a laundromat. And if you don't know what a laundromat is as a place that you go and take your clothes, then you have already lost comprehension. So if I were reading to a child, I might say, before the cover is even opened, this book is about a laundromat. Let me show you on my phone. Here's a Google image of a laundromat. It's a place that you do laundry. So in other words, we're sort of activating background knowledge before the read aloud. During the read aloud, we can do all of those think alouds. And a think aloud just is first person narrative language. It's the modeling. So I'm wondering, I'm confused, I'm getting the sense that, all of that is a think aloud. And then another thing that I often tell parents is to not shy away from repeated readings. And this is
Mm.
where I hang
Yeah.
my head in shame. There was a book that when my daughter was whatever, 4 or 5, she wanted me to read time and time again. And it was not my favorite book. I'm not even going to mention the title because inevitably I'll offend somebody who's like, I love that book. It was just not my favorite book. And so this is terrible. I hid the book. And, next time she asked for that title, I was like, I don't know where it went. We had to choose another book. Well, actually, the research shows that kids gain more in terms of their fluency, their vocabulary, their comprehension with repeated readings. So don't shy away from them and, in fact, lean into them. So what we might do is the second or third time we read a book, bring the kid's voice in more. They fill in the sentence. They look at the picture and tell us as parents, remember what happened here? So those repeated readings, as painful as they may be for adults, we sort of are like,
Yeah.
oh, can't we already read that one? Can't we read something else? They actually have real benefits.
I think that it probably has to do with there's the background knowledge piece, but the cognitive fatigue, or not fatigue, but more cognitive load, is that
Sure.
the more familiar things are, when you get into a routine, you can access other resources that you couldn't access before. And I think that that's why routines can be so important for when you don't have to explain what's happening. You don't have to explain the directions in your classroom, or when you're getting your kids ready, and you're able to pay attention to other things that you couldn't pay attention to before because you're not utilizing resources to figure out what you should be doing. And
Sure.
I'm sure that the
Such a
same
good
thing
point.
applies with, I mean, maybe even because the same thing happens with movies and TV shows with
Sure.
kids
It's
as
the
well.
familiarity. Sure.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's such a good point. Yep.
hmm I know that when I'm tired, I like to just watch something that I've watched before. When you're sitting there and you're like, I can't concentrate on a new plot right now and commit to
Yep.
something. I just want to watch something that I've seen before or read something familiar. I kind of wish that I was in the habit more of rereading books.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you reread books that you've read, or do
Um,
they sit there on your shelf?
I don't. I tend not to, but you're reminding me. My daughter just came back from sleepaway camp, and
Hmm.
sleepaway camp is a lot. I mean, talk
Yeah.
about like sensory overload. It's hundreds
Uh-huh.
of kids, and you're in the sun, and it's nonstop activity. And the end of sleepaway camp is this sort of like you're just exhausted. So when my
Hmm.
daughter's come home, all she's wanted to do is watch familiar movies. And I'm sort of like, no, no, I haven't seen you for a couple weeks. I wanted to watch this new one and that new one. And I'm recognizing now, as you're saying this, it's sort of the comfort, and this is an easy lift. I'm exhausted. I'm tapped out. I
Hmm.
just want to do something safe and comfortable, and that's not additional work. And anything that is a literacy activity, a read aloud, a conversation, that is we're surrounding kids with language. And when you're exhausted, that language can be hard to access. So it may just be the familiarity of the language at times when we're sort of already tapped out, is that sort of warm bath feeling.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, especially if the first time you read the book, there was some unfamiliar vocabulary. Like, what
Sure.
if you didn't know what a laundromat was?
Sure.
I can think of a lot of examples of that. When I think the one scenario that I can think of was that I like to give a lot, is that one of my students who ended up being on my caseload for a few years, the teacher said that they were reading a story about the ghost in the attic, and she didn't know what an attic was, so she was lost from the beginning because they, again, you most kids in the class had attics in their house, and she didn't, or maybe she did, but it wasn't something that was brought to her attention for whatever reason. And so it was, again, the context was lost. And I remember that I was like, this sounds like a language issue. And sure enough, she ended up qualifying and needing services for a few years, but then was able to go back into general education full time because we emphasized some work on vocabulary and made it known that that was something that needed to be addressed in her classroom. So,
Yeah, I'm one of the things I keep thinking about is like if I had a crystal ball now and could sort of look ahead to what is going to be down the road in the literacy landscape in 5 to 10 years, I think we're going to start to see a lot more kids with language comprehension issues. We've got some data showing that the kids who were our COVID babies, our COVID toddlers and preschoolers, when they were home during the pandemic, they didn't have as much language around them because they are not sort of in, daycare settings or schools or camps or what have you. And parents were exhausted. I get it. I was a parent during COVID. So we've actually now got some quantifiable data showing that kids heard fewer words when they were home during the pandemic. And so when we think about those kids who are, then we're toddlers and preschoolers, they're now going to be our first graders, our fourth graders, et cetera. And if we know that literacy, the foundation of literacy is oral language, if you're saying our oral language is a little shaky, well, what is that going to look like down the road? It potentially may be more issues with language comprehension and developmental language disorder or delay. So I think that's going to be a thing that we're going to need to address more explicitly with our children as a long-term impact of COVID.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, that makes it quantifiable because there was for a while a lot of speculation about, well, lots of things during COVID. We'll just leave it there. But that it points to something specific that, and again, the exposure to vocabulary, we do have, even before COVID, there was a lot of research around the impact of exposure to vocabulary. So we can link it to something that does have a body of work to support it. But then there's this specific event that happened that made it more significant for a particular group of kids. And I think the other thing that you brought up there that is really important is awareness of developmental language disorder. And there's a lot of work being done with dyslexia advocacy, which is great. But the challenge that I always had as an SLP when I was in the schools was that then if it's developmental language disorder, which I know that now there's some letters and clarification on the terminology of what you can and can't say on school documentation. But still, as of now, like typically what happens if kids have dyslexia, then they're specific learning disability. If they have developmental language delay, then it is going to be specific language impairment, or sorry, yeah, that's usually what it would be in the school. But with that, a lot of times those kids with the language comprehension issues end up being speech only. And then in the schools, that has implications about the amount of services that they are entitled to, which sometimes it's 30 minutes a week of speech. And for that student that I gave as an example, that was sufficient for her because I was able to talk to her teachers and we were able to get enough facilitation for her by focusing on vocabulary. But a lot of kids need much more than that. And it's really hard to be the one that's case managing when you know that you've got 30 minutes a week to wave your magic wand and your students probably need way more support than that. So,
well, and one of the things that I often think about is kids who struggle with dyslexia, they need explicit letter sound instruction. They need to understand the phonology of language and literacy skills. Well, that's a constrained skill, meaning it has a concreteness. It has kind of a clear scope and sequence. Once you learn your letter sounds, like check, you can, move on to the next thing. But language comprehension is unconstrained. It's limitless. I can learn a new vocabulary word every day of my life and still not reach the end of the dictionary. And so in many ways, those unconstrained skills are a little bit more challenging to address because there isn't a concreteness, quantifiable kind of agenda or approach for them. So it's seriously challenging.
That's what you just pinpointed, the inspiration for my doctoral work and the primary pain point that I had when I started working as a school SLP, and something that's shared with me very frequently is I like how you put it, that it is, what did you say, unconstrained?
Strained and unconstrained. That was written about in 2005 by a researcher, I believe, named Scott Paris.
That's a very good way to put it. And as I said before, dyslexia advocacy is very important as well. It is language-based, but just understanding, and I think that that's where, again, I had a really good conversation with an SLP who's done a lot of work in advocacy for dyslexia specifically. And, he pointed out that, yes, you can be adequately providing services if you have a more general label, but if you can make it specific and at least document it somewhere, then here is what we're working with, and here are the characteristics of this diagnosis that the student has, and you can make your interventions more specific. And if you know that you are working with a student that has a diagnosis that is unconstrained, at least you understand what you're working with. So,
Yep.
yeah.
So much to consider.
Well, thank you so much for all that you've shared. Where can people go to learn more about you and your work and all the things that we've been talking about today?
Sure. They can visit my website, Dr. Molly Ness, and it's Dr. Molly with a Y, Ness, like in Loch Ness Monster.com. And I've got lots of resources, think aloud videos. If it's something that you want to try yourself, you can watch me do it and sort of see, oh, I could try this myself. And that's how people can contact me as well.
Great. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you. I could talk to you for hours. So I appreciate your time and your advocacy work.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all of the links that were mentioned in this episode and where you can go to connect with our amazing guest. In this episode, I mentioned the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. You can learn more about that program at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. And I also mentioned Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs create a system for language therapy. You can learn more about that program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. You can get 25% off either the School of Clinical Leadership or Language Therapy Advanced Foundations as part of the Reading as Fundamental series when you join either program, or actually you could join both programs if you want to, between September 15th and October 15th. All you need to do to get 25% off of either program or both programs is enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page when you sign up. Here's what you can do right now to support the Reading is Fundamental campaign and this special series that we're doing on De Facto Leaders. First, you can go to Apple or Spotify or any other directory you use for podcasts and subscribe to the De Facto Leaders podcast. Once you listen to an episode or two, leave me a rating and review because that helps get my show into the hands of people who need the information. Finally, if you have a colleague or friend who needs to learn more about the research surrounding language and literacy, or you want to spread the word about practices and ideas you'd like to see in your school, community, or state, then tell them about De Facto Leaders so they can listen to all of the episodes in this special series. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.